Hopefully you can all see me and hear me. And if you can't, you can raise your hand or write in the chat or whatever. I'm Beth, like Beth introduced me, and I am a member of a monastic community. You can see in that photo a picture of the chapel where I pray every day, 3 times a day. Though not today, so because it was my day off, so we even get days off. And I've been involved with EA for Christians probably just for a year. And I got in touch through looking for some speakers for a podcast that I was doing who were interested in effective altruism, thinking there must be some Christians involved. So I just Googled it and I found Caleb, who some of you will know, and then realised he lived with my friend Tom, who's also here, but in a climbing centre, so he's not got his camera on. And so I got involved and have been kind of in and out, especially over the pandemic. I enjoyed coming to your Zoom conversations on a Sunday night. And before being here, I was a student at Cambridge. I studied theology, and in my 3rd year, I did a paper on charity, which involved some EA ideas and principles. And then I also did the in-depth fellowship. And so I've kind of been in and out of effective altruism. And on the other hand, Christianity, I'm pretty in with, so that hopefully will balance out my less good knowledge of EA. And ultimately, I just think Jesus is probably the best person I know at loving, and so I'm trying to follow that example the best I can in whatever way I see fit, and with my little ability at the time. And so what are we going to do in this hopefully fairly short time of me speaking, and then you can all get involved, is I'm going to take us on a brief tour of monasticism and history and what I know of it. And then I'm going to talk about some ideas where I think it's really compatible with the ideas in each I've encountered. And then I'm going to point out lessons was the best word I could find to describe it. But I imagine it's going to be more like just things we could use or kind of jump on the bandwagon with as a effective altruism for Christians community. And then I'm going to end with just us spending 5 minutes maybe in contemplative prayer in silence to kind of experience a bit of what I'm talking about. And then I'll invite you to have a chat, tell me I'm wrong, ask me questions, join in, all of those things. And so I hope that sounds good. And like a disclaimer is that I'm not the executive on these matters. So you are welcome at the end to tell me I'm wrong and jump in and join in. And there are many people I know here who are doing and living these things really well. And so I don't want to come across as patronising. So I know that there are many people committed to giving and to discerning. So yeah, without further ado, I'm going to move on. Also, yeah, I'm in the UK. So another disclaimer is that I'm really sorry if these things don't seem true for where you are in your culture, your country. And I'd love to learn from you. And you can, my email's on the last slide. You can email me, you can Facebook message me, and I'd love to chat to you about it as well. Great. Oh, look, there's more. That's what I just said. There you go. Great. So here's a nice picture on this page that we have in our chapel where I pray every day. This is a Coptic icon of Jesus and his friend, who is an abbot. So he runs a monastic community, if you don't know what that means. And I love this image because it's kind of one of the earliest pictures of Jesus and his friendship with us. And there's kind of 3 features, like 1, that he's near us, he's next to us, beside us as our friend. 2, that his arm is really kind of like long, he's not like super close. It's like classic Christian side hug. But it's distance because Jesus is close to us, but he's not controlling us. He's letting us make free decisions. That's what the people evaluating the icon have said. And the third thing is that you'll see they have big beady eyes, which can be a bit creepy. So it's good to explain them. Jesus has got big beady ones. And then the abbot, his name's Amina, has got, you can't really see in this picture, also got beady eyes. One's looking at Jesus and one's looking at the world. So the more time we spend with Jesus, we develop the eyes of Christ as we look at the world. We have one eye outward and we have one eye on Jesus. And so I think that's a good setup for kind of just like a summary of monasticism. It's about spending time with Jesus, really. And you can add in all of these rules. And if they don't work for you, they don't work for you. So it's fine. It's just about how can we become more like Jesus and look outward to the world in a way that he does. But in terms of history, around 312 AD, Christianity was the official religion of the Roman Empire. And so lots of people, lots of monks and nuns think that's when Christianity went down the drain, because before they'd been kind of persecuted following the example of a God who was crucified. And so as it became institutionalized, some guys and girls headed out to Egypt because they were like, it's not the way that we like to do it. We want to go back to that kind of communal, simple way of living. And so they went out, and they were the Desert Fathers and Mothers, who you maybe have heard of. It's interesting because this is a kind of just my own opinion, but thinking about kind of the resurgence of interest in monasticism now, and that idea of like nationalism and institutionalism of faith happening then, I think is really maybe true of society today. People are becoming a bit fed up with the nationalism of Christianity, and so they're moving to this simple monastic model. And actually, that's exactly what happened then. So it's not new. There's nothing new under the sun. Great. So you've got the Desert Fathers and Mothers, and then this guy called John Cassian. Again, I'm speaking from an incredibly Western perspective. So John Cassian spent time with them. He wrote a book called The Conferences of his experience. And that was picked up by the like OG king of monasticism, St. Benedict. And there are more, and there are key figures on my next slide, so we'll talk about that. And St. Benedict, I guess the rule of St. Benedict is where kind of a classic Western monasticism came out of, and we have a lot to credit him for. Like, he's probably the reason most of us read, and because he was one of the first people who encouraged his monks not just to pray but to study, and also lots of our institutions come out of that period of Benedictine monks and monasteries. And then, like I say, now there's, especially in the UK, I'd say, and in like contemporary evangelicalism, a big rise in interest in monasticism or some form of it, community living, a return to a rhythm of prayer. And so I think that's really interesting as we come to consider points and conjunctures with EA and kind of building a movement of Christians who consider where they give to different places. So here are key figures, some more icons. Sorry about the old photos. And some jokey things, jokey titles, because I couldn't fit all the information on the slides, so I didn't know what to put there. So like I say, we've got Benedict in the 6th century. His rule is probably the most influential book after the Bible in that time and kind of going into the 6th century. So, and not his real name, it just means blessed. He was actually, there's an essence of humility to his rule where people don't actually know much about him as an individual. And so if you've read it, I don't know, has anyone read the Rule of St. Benedict? It's a fairly dense thing to read, and it can seem pretty harsh, but actually it's context, and there's a gentleness to him. For example, he's big on silence unless there's someone at the door to welcome in, so then you're allowed to talk to them. And he seems harsh about the way he worships, but he always encourages everyone in the monastery to pray slower the first verse of the psalm so that latecomers can can still join in. So you see this kind of essence of inclusion in him. And then you have St. Francis, the Franciscans. I've put their orders underneath to kind of give a brief overview. He loves creation. And that's kind of why I love Francis. He's got this canticle of the creatures. Another kind of literary landmark is that I think his canticle for the creatures, but if there are any Italians here who want to tell me off, was one of the first things written down and preserved in Italian. And he had a really good recognition of the world, and as all beloved of God, everything is brothers and sisters. So he calls animals brother, cow, well, I don't know, cow maybe it's not the one, but so he has this kind of divinity in friendship with things that are maybe not human. One of the first kind of first marking out of that in Christianity. And he is obsessed with the cross. You might have seen the symbol of Francis is like a T, a tau, because the story goes that if he even saw two sticks crossed on the path as he walked past, that he would be moved to tears at the marvel and suffering of God and the humility of God and his love for people. And so that tau cross is from Ezekiel, weeping for the sins of Jerusalem. So that's a symbol that you'll see worn by Franciscans even today. If you ever meet them, if any of you live in London, you can go to Plasto and you can see there's a house there of Franciscans who are lovely. So we've got Francis, and then also interesting thing about Francis is he wanted to be a soldier for a really long time, and a good story is that he actually was one of the only people to cross enemy lines and go and offer prayer to the Sultan, and he was the only person let in and surviving in those crusades. And so there's a sense in which Franciscans now are compelled by Christ, but there's this level of non-pushy evangelism where they kind of just spend time with people, meet them where they're at. And then we've got St. Ignatius, who founded the Jesuits. He's the OG pros and cons list. I'll come back to that at the end because he is. And if any of you are my friends and you've ever made a decision and I've told you, just go and look at the OG pros and cons list. Hopefully this talk will help you out. So Ignatius is a Spanish saint in the late 1400s, early 1500s. And so his spiritual exercises, which are his OG pros and cons, are really famous. So you maybe have done the examen at the end of the day to reflect on your day. So there's a sense of discernment in his spirituality. Great. So there's a brief history. But at its core, what does monastic life look like? So there's a rule of life. So lots of these three figures all have their own form of rule of life. You can buy a copy in Waterstones and read them. And there are people who are committed to them. But I've pointed out like three key features here are obedience, chastity, and poverty. And all of these are part of learning what it means to pray without ceasing. So contemplation in action. And so with obedience, we have the idea that we follow Jesus and we are loving our community. We're obedient to God and we're obedient to those around us who are following God, our elders, and we're obedient to the rule, which can seem a bit draconian, but actually there's a level of commitment there to knowing what our forebears have done and following in their footsteps. And there's an interesting thing about this as well, which again I'll come back to, is lots of people think it's rules, but actually it's rule of life. So it's about regular stability. And so there's a sense in which there's like a harmony of living under a rule of life where you have every area of your life encompassed in your relationship with God. And then we have chastity, which everyone thinks is just about sex, but it's not. It's about more than that. It's about sacrifice. So many of us actually will have made our own commitments to certain like benchmarks of what we engage in, what we don't as Christians. And so this is kind of the countercultural element, and for lots of people in the monastic life, obviously they won't wear plain clothes, they'll wear habits or cassocks, so they won't have clothes, they won't have luxury items, and it's all about kind of just being countercultural against consumerism. And then poverty, again, similarly, choosing to live simply and in solidarity with the poor. And there's a beauty like in recognizing God in those who they encounter in everyday life. You'll often find Franciscans mainly, because they're the ones who go out. Benedictines like to stay in their monasteries. You'll often find them in places of poverty to meet with people, and they acknowledge the mystery of God in those moments and gain something from them. And then all of these things help us to pray without ceasing. And I've always loved the Message translation, sorry if you don't like it, of 1 Thessalonians 5, which says, I'm learning to make my whole life a prayer. And so I think there's something to learn as a community here, but for us as Christians in general, is praying without ceasing, is learning to make our whole lives a prayer, our whole lives an offering to God, our whole lives asking for God's kingdom to come. And for many in the monastic tradition, that is contemplation in action. So it comes from this secure inner life that you begin to have like this wholeness with God inside, which makes you want to experience wholeness with the world, with others, and invite other people into that. Is everyone with me? Does anyone have any questions here before I move on? This is like the historical bit. Great, we'll move on. So here I've picked up some things, I've kind of already gone over some of them, that are really, really compatible as you are engaging with EA and engaging with EA for Christians. So there's like commitment, there's a certain level of just doing it. And so we've got people who are making pledges, we've got people in our church who are tithing, or so there's a level to which you can use rule of life to make your giving part of the way that you also engage with God. So maybe I'd encourage you, if you are a bit like me, to be honest, actually, I'm here not as an expert, I'm here as someone who's doing it because I'm actually not super good at getting faith in my everyday life, is like maybe think about your giving, your effective giving as something as part of a whole scheme of things that you're doing with God, and offer that to him preferably in the rule. And there's some resources at the end that I've included that help you maybe write a rule of life. And yeah, and there's something, I think, in my tradition, you might use the word prophetic, but there's something kind of amazing about monastic life in that it's always kind of been, this is a generalization, but it's always been fairly constant in the tumultuousness of Christian history. The monasteries have kind of been like the ethical leveling out of kind of all the fusses that has gone on with maybe the papacy, the Reformation. And so you end up with this amazing thing of actually making a commitment, which is just solid, it's just faithful, and it just happens. And I think there's something to be said of us as people who are considering giving radically, or giving in a way that is different to many others in the church, that is could be really consistent and could be just kind of quietly keeping things stable in the background. So there you go. And then simplicity and sacrifice, again, radical giving is something lots of people here, I'm sure, engage with. And then like lifestyle choices, we can with our rule of life see our work and the way we spend our money and what we eat and all of those things as part of our rule of life. They don't have to be detached from how we give our money. They can be part of that too. And then we also have the idea of reconciliation and solidarity. And my favorite thing about the rule of St. Benedict is that the first word is listen. And so lots of it is about listening to other people, listening to where there's need. And so I think there's a level to which being willing to kind of sort through sensationalism and hype to just do what we believe and discern to be the right thing is about listening and recognizing the stories of others who we may not normally platform, and also seeing everyone as our brothers and sisters, regardless of where they are or what they can give us. And this is all part of seeking the restoration of God's kingdom. And then fourthly, discernment, a desire to make godly decisions. And I'm sure this is, again, something we're all being here engaging in, this kind of critical thinking of how do I best use what I've been given? The parable of the talents, how do I best use what I've been given to do the most that I can for God's kingdom? And so, like Ignatius, that can be living with things, it can be deeply exploring, it can be doing things in community, learning from each other. And interestingly, for Benedict, his work tools were important, just as important as the things that were on the altar. So there's again a level to which we need to bring the same care that we take to worship to our work elsewhere. There's not a conjunction between that. So there's 4 things I think that are probably really, really similar already and useful to adapt. And then here I have 4 lessons, which are largely the same, but just spun a different way into maybe how we can be a bit more inclusive. And this one is for Tom Milton, because I often talk about EEA evangelism, and we talk about it together. But I think there's a level of that in all of this, is how can we bring other people in to consider these things if they feel a bit, I don't know, icky about them. Let me just find my notes. There we go. Great. And so vocation. I was talking to someone a couple of weeks ago about each, who was struggling with the idea that 80,000 Hours website didn't like her career as a teacher. And I could definitely relate to that. I thought, yeah, I don't have the skills necessarily to be living in this most effective career that 80,000 Hours would be, or maybe I'm not in a position where I'm able to earn to give or anything. And so I think a lesson that we can learn about the rule of life is, if we were to adopt this as a community, or whether you're going to adopt it in a small group, or as we tell other people about how we spend our money and how we live our lives, this might be something that kind of counts people in where they might otherwise count themselves out of this kind of model. And it allows us to consider what we do with our time and our words, and actually our prayers. If you are a Christian, how we also pray for things can be a place of inclusion and of vocation, counting everyone in. So yeah, and then EA evangelism. We're mostly joking when I say this, but I think this is true. If we want to make a great impact, we've got to get people to jump on the bandwagon. And so I think that the popularity and rising popularity of rule of life actually is such a great opportunity to get people to consider where they give their money, how they give it. A really simple change that actually I made after being in the discussion groups on Sundays is separating the money which I gave to my church and the money which I gave as my charitable giving, and kind of viewing that in a different way after the conversations I'd had. And so how I incorporate that into the scheme of how I run my life actually was done through conversation with others and through watching how other people did it. And so I think this is a tool, a rule of life is a tool that we can all use to encourage other people to engage. And that's all going to be done in community. And a side note is this reciprocity thing, which I think I didn't quite know where to fit in all of my varied thoughts, in that there's a level of community with those to who we give that I'm not sure I've worked out how that works in EA. We're kind of disparaging of the idea of the warm fuzzy feeling, but I think within faith, and I think within especially the monastic life, there's a sense that there's some kind of divine interchange that happens when we give and when we encounter brokenness. And I don't think this justifies doing things that are self-serving or naive, but I do think that there's a level of mutual listening that could happen. And again, just recognition of the way that our giving shapes us. And I think that's okay. And I think that is part of community. And I think how we use our time and how we use our energies closer to home, for most of us closer to home, that gives us a sense of this reciprocity of giving, and to not beat ourselves up about that, because I think that is actually a space of grace, and the idea of the Beatitudes as a place of grace, as a place of meeting God as we give to others. And then the other thing, going back to the more obvious sense of community, is just about doing it together. We can hold each other accountable. Many of us, I'm sure, already do this. We're in groups of friends, small groups. Maybe each community is this, or maybe you've taken a pledge, and that is your level of accountability. That community helps you do it together and learning together. I don't really have the time or energy or even intellectual ability always to make all the good decisions about where to give my money, how to use my time. And so there's a certain level of trust that I offer other people, that I offer to those who I give my money. And so there's a level that as we engage with monasticism, we can learn from each other and we can listen from each other. And with the rule of life, we're obedient to each other, just as we're obedient to Jesus. And so I think we can achieve more when we put our heads together. And this fourth thing is how we encounter mystery. Where I work, we often say, when we meet people, we want to see them as a mystery to enter into rather than a problem to fix. And I am very on board with the kind of critical thinking and evaluation involved in EA. But there's a mindset that you can fall into, I think, of kind of, and I think this is with all faith, not just with giving. I can be cynical about other areas of faith. If you've spent any length of time with me, you'll know that. But as we begin to see people as mysteries to enter into rather than problems to fix, I think we encounter more of God, because I don't actually think God makes loads of sense. But again, you can argue with me on that later. And so I think that's another lesson we can learn from monasticism. They were really content with mystery. They sat with it. They kept going, even though it didn't make sense, even though things were kind of wreaking havoc all around them. And that wasn't always seemingly effective, but they kept going. And so I think we can learn to journey with people a bit, not jump to the conclusion straight away, bring people with us and find some way of encountering God in that space. Great. I think that's everything I've got to say. And I'm sorry it's a bit all over the place. And I hope they're kind of good. It's good food for thought.